Alright, so some good news has just come in. A new student is coming to Web, and apparently their rating in chess is extremely high. Their FIDE rating is roughly 2000, I've heard, and they claim to be the best player in Australia for our age group. Um, so I'm pretty excited to meeting this person and having a game against them. Um, so anyway, in preparation, I read some articles this morning on how to beat people with far higher ratings. Um, And these are some of the things that I learnt and tried to apply to this game against this 1920, which is relatively high. So the first thing you want to do is you want to try and stay away from popular theory. So if it's, the Italian game or you're playing a Sicilian defense, for example, you don't want to play these just because your opponent will often know more theory than you, and eventually you'll be brought to a stage where they know what to do and you don't, and so they'll get a big advantage if you don't know what you're doing. Um, and the second thing you want to do is you want to try and make the position as complex as possible, as quickly as possible. So I've found that I'm not very good at positional play. I'm much better at tactical play. So if there's a if there's a combination that I can apply to the position, often I'll find it. Um, or at least if it's in a puzzle I will, because my mindset's different. In a game usually there'll be a tactic in front of me, I'll be like, huh, I bet there's a tactic, and then I'll just play something that doesn't really make sense, and I'll look at the computer analysis afterwards and I'll realize, yeah, actually, in fact, that thing I was thinking about was real, and I could have played it and won the game very quickly. So I need to be working on that more. And anyway, my teacher said that in order to counter this problem, you should probably just do more tactics puzzles, and you should play games with longer time controls, so that if you get that feeling, then you're able to fully calculate the line that you're thinking about, so that you're no longer in doubt when a tactic arises. Um, for those positional players out there, I'm not sure how I can help you with your position, so to speak, in your position. Anyway, so this is a game against 1920, pretty high, and I tried to keep these things in mind while playing against them. So, e4 Sicilian. I was a bit annoyed, as I said, because this is theory, and I wanted to get out of that as quickly as possible. So after e5, I was pretty comfortable after the knight moves to f5. This is an aggressive move that gets us out of theory. This is barely any games have been played like this, I'm sure. Um, so I was pretty confident my opponent wouldn't be able to just know the moves. So the reason I played my bishop here was to pin the knight and to prevent this bishop from moving out anywhere along this diagonal, and because I accidentally clicked before, you already know that they will move out in this diagonal, and that's a big mistake. They shouldn't have done that. But anyway, the reason I played this is because the knight will be pinned to the queen, the bishop can't stop the pin, and this makes this pawn very weak, because now, let's just say they make a silly move, this knight will be able to take this pawn, because this knight won't be able to take it because of the pin. So anyway, the reason I played my bishop up here was to make this pawn really weak and stop this knight from being able to move. Um, Goodness, my headset keeps dying. Anyway, I decided to, after they moved their bishop, take advantage of the fact that it was no longer protecting this pawn. So I took it with check. It's important. I moved my bishop here to try and create a threat of a discovered check on the king. Let's just say they made another silly move. If this were the case, then I'd be able to play knight here, attacking the king with the bishop and the knight, and at the same time, I'd be able to I'm attacking the queen. So, the king has to move, because two pieces are attacking him. He can't take out both. And then, I'm able to take the queen. So let's see what the advantage is in this position. Yeah, look at that. 9.9 and rising. There's gonna be no coming back from that. I mean, it doesn't really matter how high your rating is, I'm gonna beat you in this kind of position. Um, so, they decided to move their queen to prevent this knight move, and oh, let's turn that off. The reason they played this is to continue stacking on pressure to this pinned knight. I can't move this knight, similar to over here, because it's pinned to the king. If it were to move, then my king would be put in check, and that's simply illegal. So, moving on. I moved my knight out of the way so that I could try and bring the king into the center. This was my thinking. So after I take the knight, the king has to try and defend it because it's the only piece that could. And then after I take it, the king would have to take it. So the king is now forced out into the open, which basically introduces a ton of attacks into the game. So I brought my queen out with the check. The computer reckons taking this is a good idea, but instead I checked them with my bishop. The reason I did this was to try and take advantage of these very weak squares, and after this move, I was calculating this for a really, really long time. I was looking at it for about 8 minutes, and anyway, it turns out my thinking was completely right, and after this move, the advantage is 10.8. And again, that's really difficult to come back from. So, if the queen takes, which is, obviously a threat, the rook is going to die, but we do not care about this in the slightest. After the queen checks us, eventually, the queen and the bishop simultaneously attack these two squares, which black is forced to defend. So if they were to say play a move like this, which then defends against these, my pawn, which I put on d5 for a reason, which is to stop this so that I could attack these two squares, it wouldn't be able to move there, so I'd be able to take it. At the same time as attacking these, I'm also able to take the rook with a check. So what I'd probably do in this position is I would take this, and then I'd take this. And they've lost two pieces in two moves, and their king is still out in the open, and the queen has basically done nothing. The bishop can't come out all that easily. The rook is going to have problems developing. Their pawns are all over the place. Every single one of them is isolated, except for, these two. So they're not in a good way at all. But anyway, despite my 8 minutes of calculation, I decided that this was a little bit too risky, and I didn't want to let them take this pawn and win this rook, because I was too wrapped up. I didn't see that these two would be undefendable, basically. So I decided to play this to prevent the bishop from coming out. It was more of a prophylactic move. Basically, I didn't want this bishop coming out. It couldn't go there, because what's the point? It couldn't go there because of the pawn. It couldn't go there because of the queen. And so I decided to stop its only other square by moving the pawn there. They decided to develop their knight, which was a good idea because it stopped my queen from coming to the crucial f6 square, which, as mentioned, attacks these two. I developed my bishop with the intentions of castling. I brought my bishop back in a way that if this pawn ever needed help, I would be able to push it with a tempo on the queen. So just as an example, if this was, say, under attack, I'd be able to push this, defend it, while also attacking the queen with the bishop. Oops. Okay, so they decided to push this so that they'd be able to put their bishop there, so that they could attack this pawn. And for a little while I was thinking about making this move, but in the end I decided not to. It wouldn't have been a bad move. The computer doesn't think anything of it. In fact, actually, oh wow, it even thinks that it's the best move here. Goodness, I'm on. Yeah, it's funny how these things happen. You look over a game once it's done with computer help, and turns out a lot of the things you think about are right. Anyway, I decided in the end to just play conservatively and just castle. So I wanted to try and bring my bishop into the king side because the king was on a light square, my queen was on a light square, and I thought maybe I could try and attack them some more. And if I was able to bring it here, then and check the king, I'd also be able to win this pawn, which I thought was cool. I could, you know, get some more material. I was already up 2 pawns. Okay, so basically this is where the game ended. So I played d6 to not only attack the king with the pawn, but to also take the bishop with the queen. And so Black decided in this position that it had gone too far. They weren't going to be able to come back from this, and so they resigned. After the king takes, the bishop is taken, and let's have a look at the advantage. I'm up 7.6, and honestly, if I were them as well, I'd ask myself, what's the point? Do I keep playing and learn, or do I lose face? Anyway, that was my game.